Oh, turn on my mic so everybody can hear me. Welcome. Today's hearing is long overdue. It is my understanding that this is the first time in over 20 years that the HHS Inspector General has appeared before Energy and Commerce Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee. This morning's subcommittee hearing is our second Inspector General's hearing. As Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee Chair, it is my intent to have Inspector Generals testifying before us on a regular basis. Today we will hear from Inspector General Christi Grimm on her office's ongoing oversight work and investigation priorities. We will focus on three critical areas that are plagued with issues and concerns that we must address moving forward. First, we will be examining HHS's abject failure to completely or to competently manage the record number of unaccompanied minors in the care of the Office of Refugee and Resettlement, abbreviated ORR. The HHS Inspector General's office has done excellent work to shed light on this crisis. Back in February, we held a hearing on the border in Texas, and as I said at that time, the Biden administration's policies are the root cause of the border crisis we are experiencing. This only adds to the inhumane conditions experienced by unaccompanied children once they enter ORR care. The surge of unaccompanied children was an entirely foreseeable event of President Biden's refusal to secure the border. While running for office, President Biden pledged to reduce deportations and end Title 42. This encouraged more migrants, and the number of annual unaccompanied minors crossing the border during the Biden administration grew to astronomical numbers. From fiscal years 2018 through 2020, ORR averaged around 44,500 referrals per year. In fiscal year 2022, ORR received over 128,900 referrals, almost 3 times the recent historical average. According to a report by CBS News, nearly 130,000 migrant children entered the U.S. government's shelter system in fiscal year 2022. These numbers are staggering and a direct result of the Biden administration's open border policies. As the Inspector General has now documented across multiple reports, somehow HHS was caught unprepared for this surge despite it being the natural result of administration policies. In a desperate attempt to increase capacity, ORR contracted with organizations with no relevant experience in safely caring for unaccompanied children. The result was child neglect and abuse. In an effort to quickly reduce the number of children in its care, ORR prioritized fast-tracking the release of unaccompanied children to sponsors instead of taking the time and effort to thoroughly vet those sponsors. The result was putting children at increased risk of being trafficked and exploited. We've all seen the news articles about children working full-time in slaughterhouses or as roofers or in other dangerous and inappropriate professions. In response to this crisis, HHS continues to keep the assembly line of unaccompanied children moving as fast as possible. When whistleblowers raise concerns about children having panic attacks, self-harming, or living in unsuitable conditions, they are retaliated against. Further, HHS denied media access to emergency intake shelters. The priority seems to be to keep this issue out of sight rather than child welfare. It is unconscionable, and I want to thank the OIG's office for their work holding HHS accountable. The second area of focus for our hearing is NIH grant management. There's an increasing body of evidence suggesting that NIH fails to conduct routine oversight of grantees. This failure extends to research done in foreign countries involving potential pandemic pathogens, those such as the now infamous grant to EcoHealth Alliance. The Inspector General's audit found that NIH and EcoHealth Alliance failed to effectively monitor and document the activities of subgrantees, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology. As a result of NIH's failure to secure laboratory notebooks and other records, the U.S. government has no adequate documentation of the coronavirus experiments conducted in Wuhan during the fall of 2019. This is important because that's when COVID arose. In light of these oversight failures, it is incomprehensible to me that the NIH continues to fund EcoHealth Alliance when they failed to secure the documents required by their contracts that would have given us a better picture of COVID's origins. The final goal is to hear from the Inspector General about their work on Medicaid and Medicare program integrity. With the public health emergency now officially over, returning Medicaid to congressionally intended role as a safety net insurer of last resort is critical. Between fiscal year 2018 and fiscal year 2021, improper payments grew by over 138%. From reviewing the Inspector General's body of work on CMS oversight, it is clear that her office takes Medicare and Medicaid program integrity seriously. What is less clear to me is whether HHS and CMS are also committed to preventing fraud, waste, and abuse in these programs, or perhaps it's like the situation with the children. They'd rather keep it out of sight and hopefully out of the minds of Congress. Thank you for your work, Ms. Grimm, but I can assure HHS that this is on the front of the minds of us in Congress who have oversight over them. Thank you, and I yield back. I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Kester, for her 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you especially for following through on your commitment after our discussion about keeping eyes on the unaccompanied children situation especially. And thank you, Inspector General Grimm, for being here today. HHS is a vital agency with enormous responsibilities that touches the lives of every American, and the agency ensures the health, safety, and well-being of people across the country. We recently had the opportunity to hear from Inspectors General from EPA, Department of Energy, Department of Commerce about how they are overseeing the deployment of funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, all historic legislation that's lowering costs, creating good jobs, and creating healthier, more resilient communities. I'm very proud of our committee's leadership in enacting these landmark laws, but to ensure that they reach their full potential, we must remain committed to oversight. That is why the Inspector General is so important. There are areas of shared concern regarding HHS. In particular, members on both sides of the aisle are alarmed over recent reports of child labor exploitation involving children who migrated to the U.S. without their parents and were placed with sponsors through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, ORR. While the administration has announced an interagency effort to crack down on exploitative child labor and provide responsive post-relief services to more children and improve sponsor vetting, additional reporting as recently as yesterday raises significant concerns. So it's important to hear from you, Ms. Grimm, about your ongoing oversight of HHS ORR. We know that long stays in federal facilities are detrimental to the health and well-being of children, but HHS must ensure that it balances the need for efficient placement with the safety and high-quality services for children under ORR's care. On a different topic, I appreciate the lessons that have been learned thanks to the IG's work with NIH throughout the pandemic. Federally funded research has led to breakthroughs that help us fight deadly diseases, make advancements in treatments and therapeutics, and develop life-saving vaccines. NIH funding is a critical investment in our nation's well-being, and I'm glad that the IG and NIH are working together to improve the agency's grant oversight. Oversight of NIH research funding is important, and it is our job to make sure that these dollars are well spent and well monitored. I hope we can move away from the politicization of the global pandemic that killed more than 1.1 million Americans to oversight and sensible policy reforms. We need to make sure that our oversight efforts are focused on improving NIH and the success of its grant-making work rather than limiting the ability to do important work, including with global partners. And I'm confident that we can do that without vilifying individual scientists or tearing down our health institutions. We're also now less than a month away from another milestone for our nation and for HHS. Thanks to the leadership of President Biden and congressional Democrats, we're on track to end the public health emergency. We must ensure that our neighbors who will see a change in their health coverage under the Medicaid unwinding are not lost in the shuffle. Democrats are taking responsibility for prioritizing efforts that make the nation's health infrastructure stronger, protect and strengthen access to health care for everyone, and invest in future pandemic preparedness while utilizing lessons learned over the past 3 years. I sincerely thank your office for the important work that you do to ensure integrity at HHS and prevent waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back and now recognize the chairman or chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. McMorris Rogers, for her 5 minutes for an opening statement. Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to Health and Human Services Inspector General Christi Grimm. This is the first time in more than 20 years that the HHS Inspector General has appeared before the Oversight and Investigations Subcommittee. It's long overdue, and I'm grateful that you're here. First, your office has done important work exposing how the administration has failed to assure the safety and well-being of unaccompanied children crossing the border. This is a crisis, and as the ranking member just said, it's alarming to all of us. And it's been made worse by President Biden's open border agenda. From 2019 to 2021, the number of unaccompanied minors referred to HHS from the Department of Homeland Security increased by more than 75%. Last year, nearly 130,000 migrant children entered the shelter system, an all-time high. It's more than just numbers. The New York Times investigation has revealed that unaccompanied migrant children are alone and being exploited. These are young teenagers without their parents, working long shifts on farms, in factories, hotels, and on construction sites. According to this Times investigation, HHS caseworkers are under pressure by the Biden administration to quickly process these children. As a result, sponsors aren't being vetted properly, and Health and Human Services isn't keeping track of these children. Quote, overall, the agency lost immediate contact with a third of migrant children. That's tens of thousands of kids who are at risk of further exploitation. And we now know that people were raising the alarm at HHS, including directly to Secretary Becerra. HHS and the Biden White House must be held accountable for how it could have possibly missed or ignored this crisis. In addition, we'll also focus today on how HHS is spending and managing trillions of taxpayer dollars. This includes how the National Institutes of Health is failing to ensure proper oversight of its grants, especially in foreign countries like in China. We find the HHS OIG audit report about NIH's ineffective monitoring of the Wuhan lab and EcoHealth Alliance very troubling, especially given the risky nature of this research and its potential to start a pandemic. It's unacceptable that today, because NIH failed to effectively monitor the Wuhan lab and EcoHealth Alliance, that key data related to American taxpayer-funded grants is still under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. The American people deserve answers to this and also transparency if this failure to oversee grant funding is pervasive across HHS. Finally, we're asking you to help us provide needed oversight of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS. CMS has an annual budget of more than $1 trillion and oversees or administers health coverage for millions of Americans. According to a CNBC report, there is more than $100 billion in fraud each year in Medicare and Medicaid. One criminal raked in millions from Medicare fraud, more than a decade. And he told CNBC, quote, I was low profile, nobody knew me, I had everything, I had houses, I had cars, I had watches, end of quote. In addition, your written testimony discusses that in fiscal year 2021 alone, improper payments made up for 21% of all Medicaid spending. That's 1 in every $5 spent improperly. These numbers are staggering. Surely we can all agree that we need to ensure the integrity of the federal health programs that so many people, including seniors, people with disabilities, mothers, and those most in need, rely on. With the end of the public health emergency, it is critical that CMS work to reduce the amount of improper payments by Medicaid and Medicare. And I hope to hear how the Inspector General's office will help CMS restore the financial integrity of these programs as we return to normal post-pandemic life. I worry not enough is being done by CMS and that the administration is reluctant to take common sense actions that would reduce the instances of waste, fraud, and abuse. We want to hear more about the recommendations that you have for these vital programs. As I said in our hearing with the Inspectors General, with other federal agencies, responsible stewardship of federal funds should not be a partisan issue. As duly elected members of the People's House, it is our Article I responsibility to conduct oversight so the government is responsible to those we serve. That's our goal today, especially for how the administration has made the border and cost of living crises worse. Again, Inspector Grimm, we're really pleased that you're here. Look forward to your testimony regarding some of these most serious challenges. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, the subcommittee has a real opportunity to conduct important oversight of the Department of Health and Human Services, and I just hope we take advantage of this opportunity to put people over politics. After all, HHS's work is crucial to the everyday lives of Americans. It's tasked with ensuring the health of our families, the safety and development of new drugs, the response to public health emergencies and pandemics, and much, much more. And we're joined today by HHS Inspector General Grimm, whose office has the tremendous responsibility of overseeing the agency's critical work. And it is this committee's responsibility to ensure that HHS has the support it needs to carry out its work. Over the last couple of years, congressional Democrats have worked to provide HHS with the funding and authorities that it needed to address the pandemic and to make health care more affordable and accessible for American families. The American Rescue Plan provided HHS the tools and resources necessary to combat the pandemic by ramping up the distribution and administration of life-saving vaccines. The American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act expanded health care coverage and lowered costs through the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, saving the average family $2,400 a year in premiums. The Inflation Reduction Act is also lowering prescription drug prices for America's seniors. And these laws are making a real difference in the lives of the American people. And while we're still losing far too many Americans every day to COVID-19, we have come a very long way, thanks in large part to the hardworking public servants at HHS. Now, the key point of conducting congressional oversight is to examine how best we can improve and support government agencies to ensure they work effectively for the American people. This is particularly important as the public health emergency ends. Emergency programs and authorizations will wind down and return to pre-pandemic operations. It's critical that during this transition, this committee, the IG, and the staff at HHS focus on how to support states and localities, as well as families emerging from the public health crisis. And while we're talking about HHS oversight, I must take this opportunity to say that HHS, and in particular the Food and Drug Administration, face serious threats from extremist Republican-appointed judges. In a case challenging FDA's decades-old approval of the drug mifepristone, these extreme judges are making unprecedented decisions that are not grounded in science or in law. The case is now sitting before the Supreme Court, and on Friday, 253 members of Congress filed an amicus brief seeking to protect the FDA against this unwarranted judicial intrusion. 2 decades of science and FDA analysis have clearly demonstrated that this drug is safe, and it's imperative that women have access to medication abortion, as some states implement increasingly draconian restrictions on women's reproductive health care. But this lawsuit by right-wing extremists seeks to completely undermine FDA's authority to approve drugs and to damage FDA's hard-earned reputation as the international gold standard in drug approval. Our agencies need to be the ones making the important decisions based on data and science, not partisan judges. And doctors must be able to prescribe safe, approved drugs to their patients without the interference of lawyers. These decisions attempt to undermine FDA's drug approval process and to restrict access to FDA-approved medication. That's why all 23 committee Democrats have committed or have requested an immediate hearing in this committee on the unprecedented decisions threatening our healthcare institutions. Scientists are against this radical judicial intervention, the pharmaceutical industry is against it, doctors are against it, and patients are against it. So while I appreciate today's hearing with Inspector General Grimm, The Republican majority should immediately schedule a hearing on this existential threat to FDA's drug approval authority. We simply must examine the impacts of these extreme decisions that place ideology, politics, and judicial activism above science. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. That now concludes members' opening statements. The chair would like to remind members that pursuant to committee rules, all members' written opening statements will be made a part of the record. Please provide those to the clerk promptly. All right. Now we have the opportunity to introduce our witness today. We want to thank our witness for being here today and taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. You will have the opportunity to give an opening statement followed by a round of questions from members. Today's witness is the Honorable Christi Grimm, Inspector General for the Department of Health and Human Services. We appreciate you being here today and look forward to hearing from you. As you are aware, this committee is holding an oversight hearing, and when doing so, it has been the practice of this committee to take testimony under oath. Do you have any objections to testifying under oath?
I do not.
She does not. Seeing no objection, we'll proceed. The chair also would advise you that you're entitled to be advised by counsel pursuant to House rules. Do you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today?
I do not.
And seeing no request for counsel, please rise and raise your right hand. Do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Seeing the witness answered in the affirmative, you are now sworn in and under oath, subject to the penalties set forth in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. With that, I now recognize Inspector General Christi Grimm for her 5 minutes to give an opening statement. Ms. Grimm.
Good morning, Chairman Griffith, Ranking Member Castor, Chair McMorris-Rogers, and Ranking Member Pallone. Also distinguished members of the subcommittee. I am Christi Grimm. I am the Inspector General for the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Our mission at HHS OIG is to prevent, detect, and combat fraud, waste, and abuse. Our work helps ensure that HHS programs better serve the American people and that taxpayer dollars are not misspent. Our portfolio is vast and it is varied. Last year, my office was responsible for oversight of over 100 programs and more than $2.4 trillion in department expenditures. We have only 2 cents for every $100 that the department spends. We conduct efficient, consequential, high-impact oversight work with our limited resources, but much more needs to be done to thwart fraud, identify misspent funds, and protect people from harm. To be candid, without more resources, we will be unable to keep pace with the department threats. We risk falling behind and allowing HHS dollars to be diverted to fraud. I'll spend the next few moments briefly addressing the 3 specific areas the subcommittee requested. First, the Unaccompanied Children Program. Ensuring that children are safe is a top priority for me and my office. Unfortunately, our oversight work over the past 2 decades has raised a variety of concerns about the safety and welfare of unaccompanied children in HHS's care. Unaccompanied children enter the U.S. with no parent or guardian to care for them. HHS is completely responsible for their well-being until being released to an adult sponsor in the U.S. A recent report focusing on case management services at the Fort Bliss Emergency Intake Site demonstrates the child safety risks our work has uncovered. At this site, we found many caseworkers lacked experience and did not receive adequate training. We identified that the case management system was lacking in basic capabilities, including helping to screen the adults the children were to be placed with. We found the streamlined process to expedite children's release from the facility may have increased risk of release to unsafe adult sponsors. Finally, we heard from staff that they were reticent to report problems for fear of retaliation. We're now conducting a more comprehensive review of the process used to screen potential adult sponsors. Next, I'll turn to grants management at NIH. We have found consistent weaknesses in NIH's oversight of grant recipients. These include fraud, unallowable costs, and inadequate internal controls and monitoring of grants. For instance, a recent audit found that NIH and its grant recipient, EcoHealth Alliance, did not effectively monitor awards and subawards. The report also found that NIH did not exercise rigorous oversight over potentially high-risk research. While issues related to the type of research in science may be complex, our findings involve common failures of routine grant oversight, like failing to follow up on progress reports. Last, I'll touch on oversight of CMS. The intricacy and breadth of the Medicare and Medicaid programs make oversight complex, challenging, and resource-intensive for CMS. We use a data-driven risk assessment approach to target risks, such as inflated costs, improper or wasteful payments, and poor quality of care. We also deploy sophisticated data analytics and technology to pinpoint and pursue costly and harmful fraud schemes. Yet, despite extensive reviews and enforcement, our limited resources do not allow us to provide comprehensive oversight of Medicare and Medicaid, programs that spend $1.6 trillion annually. Said simply, we lack a sufficient number of law enforcement agents, auditors, evaluators, and information technology specialists to detect and respond to ever-emerging fraud trends. OIG is turning down between 300 and 400 viable criminal and civil healthcare fraud cases annually. These uninvestigated cases represent unchecked fraud and the potential for patients to be put in harm's way. Notwithstanding rigorous efforts by my office, by HHS, and Congress, serious fraud, waste, and abuse continue to grow and threaten HHS programs. If enacted, the President's FY 2024 requested resources for OIG would go a long way toward addressing shortfalls, particularly with respect to combating fraud. I thank you for the invitation to appear before you today. I thank you for underscoring the importance of resources for program integrity. I thank you for your commitment to improving HHS programs and protecting the people they serve, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony. We'll now move to the question and answer portion. I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. So I said this in a hearing recently or in comments. The opposite sides of the aisle may not agree on the policies that brought these children to our border, but once they're in our care and we've taken responsibility for them, I think we all agree that they ought to be taken care of properly. They ought to be getting educated. They ought not be just dispersed to be labor for construction or plants where they're putting together packages of cups or vegetables, whatever it might be. As a background note, at one time in my life, I practiced in domestic relations and did child custody cases and was a guardian ad litem for children. And I went to Fort Bliss in 2021, and I started asking questions, and the answers I got were shocking. So I've been raising this issue since that time, but it doesn't seem like it's been doing any good. You have done a report now, and you've indicated that there's some preliminary things that are happening. What is HHS doing to make the vetting process of these sponsors better? Because when I was there, they basically were just checking on the internet to see if they had any violent crimes or crimes against children on their record. They weren't looking into what kind of house they were going to be in, what the sleeping arrangements were, what school they were going to, all of things which, as a guardian ad litem or somebody who was practicing in domestic relations, would have checked into for the safety of a child before I ever advised a court that I thought the child should be placed in one home or another home or wherever. So what are they doing differently now than they weren't doing in 2021? Because based on the press reports and your report, it doesn't look like much has changed.
Thank you, Chairman Griffith, for your question. We did do a report looking at Fort Bliss. We did an inspection of that site. We interviewed 66 ORR officials. We made 9 recommendations in that report. We are in receipt of the department's response to that report. If I may,
Yes, ma'am.
I will highlight 3 key areas that are of utmost importance that the department, that ORR get right. The 3 themes, and these capture findings across many of our reports, including Fort Bliss, include hiring, screening, and retaining qualified facility employees. The second has to do with robust, fully functioning electronic case management system. The third is communication internally and externally that prioritizes children's interests and concerns about potential harm to children. We're in receipt of their response to our Fort Bliss report. They are undertaking action. We consider the recommendation still open until we can examine the documentation. If you were to ask me what the number one thing they need to be working on and to do to get right, it's to completely overhaul the ORR portal before the next anticipated surge. It has not been functional for an incredibly long time, and there have been starts and stops, and they have begun again, but they need to get it right.
And when you say portals, for the folks watching back home, that's the process they use to take children who've come to the border unaccompanied and give them to some kind of a sponsor. I would hope that they would do a better background vetting, because according to the latest report from the New York Times, the administration is taking the position that once they've released them, they no longer have any responsibility. So we better be making sure we're putting them into good homes before we release them, because there were too many reports of kids not being educated, working long hours overnight. One child complained that he would really like to learn how to read, but he can't, and he's been with the sponsor now for a couple of years. It's outrageous. Are they moving in that direction? I know that it's not easy, but are they moving in that direction based on what you've seen? Or is it too early to tell?
You raise a number of different dimensions
I do.
of sponsor screening. I'm going to zero in on our Fort Bliss report. We did find that the case managers were not, some of them were not qualified. They did not receive training. They struggled to do things like vet sponsors. We found that the case management system, the UC portal, that it frequently crashed. It didn't allow for searches of things like addresses and prior sponsors that may have housed children before. They waived certain requirements for sponsor vetting that included looking at adults that might be in the household for certain categories of sponsors. All of these things elevated risks.
Yeah.
We had recommendations for all of this. They are reporting that they're working on it. We need to review documentation to ensure they're headed in the
And we'll probably have another hearing later this year on the same subject, just to follow up, at least one, maybe two more, because I think we're all very concerned about it. And I think we've got to do better, because what we're doing is we're creating a subclass out of these unaccompanied children who can be exploited, and that's not appropriate. That's not what this was set up to do, and I don't think anybody on either side of the aisle is in favor of that. That being said, I've used up my time. I yield back and now recognize Ms. Castor, the ranking member, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would wholeheartedly agree that we need to have a follow-up oversight hearing on this topic. And thank you, Ms. Grimm, for your attention and recommendations to keeping unaccompanied children safe. These reports are alarming and disturbing, and we've got to help you, help the agency repair so children are kept safe. I have a basic question for you. When does the Office of Refugee Resettlement Responsibility begin, and where does it end when it comes to the well-being of the unaccompanied children?
Typically when the Department of Homeland Security moves a child that is considered unaccompanied into the ORR program, and they're asked to do that at DHS within 72 hours, they then become, they're in the custody of HHS. Typically, they would go into a facility, be vetted for a sponsor. When they're placed with a sponsor, it is the department's interpretation of existing legislation that when they are transferred to a sponsor, legally, their jurisdiction does end. However, we have recommended, they have committed to do welfare checks, but it is their legal read that their custody ends when they are transferred to an adult sponsor here in the U.S.
I see. Because there just seems to be an overarching responsibility to ensure that those children are, first and foremost, getting to school and are being kept safe. So is there you're saying that HHS now, they're instituting some of your recommendations for case management and those welfare checks, but is there something additional in the law where we need to spell out succinctly a requirement for those ongoing welfare checks? Or is there some, or at that point, is it a state responsibility under the state child welfare laws?
So let me, I know that Secretary Becerra recently testified on this and testified on the jurisdiction. We do not get in the middle of that interpretation of legal jurisdiction. I want to clarify something that I said. There are certain circumstances for certain children where the department does work to connect them with certain social services, medical services. So there's a certain category of children. I do not know all the specifics about that.
Okay. I understand that you are, in addition to your ongoing analysis here, you have an ongoing study
Yes.
underway. And when can we expect your latest recommendations to be released?
Representative Castor, we have several ongoing studies. The study that I believe you are most interested in has to do with the vetting of sponsors. We have completed data collection. We are developing the findings. I would expect that report to be in draft within the next couple of months.
Okay. And I heard you loud and clear, the most critical piece right now to ensure the appropriate vetting of sponsors is the overhaul of the ORR portal. And does the agency, does HHS have adequate funding right now and contractors and to make that happen?
The question on whether they have adequate funding, I do think that's a better question for ORR to respond to. As far as why it matters, it is the case management system ORR uses to oversee the well-being and safety of children while they're in care. It's the tool ORR uses to ensure adequate sponsor screening, to ensure children are not placed with labor or sex trafficking situations. It's what they use to track separated children so they can be reunited with parents when appropriate. It's where they monitor incidents of potential physical or sexual abuse while in HHS custody. And all of our experience as an OIG teaches us that you need effective data systems to conduct meaningful oversight. They have responded to us that they have taken, I believe, 70 specific actions for the UC portal. I'll be candid, we've been here before. And I think the proof will be in the eating of the pudding. We have to see whether those outputs translate into better functionality for the system, better functionality for case managers to vet sponsors.
Thank you, and we're committed to that as well. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back and now recognize the chair of the full committee, Ms. McMorris-Rogers, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In today's New York Times, there's an article, Migrant Children Worked as U.S. Ignored Warnings. Whistleblowers say White House officials were alerted about risk to minors. Without objection, I'd like to have this article inserted into the record.
And Madam Chair, is that the article where Matt Haygood, Senior Director of Children's Services, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, asked the question, we're waiting for the congressional hearing that's like, how did this happen to all these kids?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
All right, without objection, enter it into the record.
Thank you. It's a deeply disturbing investigative piece on child exploitation. It details how the administration ignored multiple whistleblowers who raised concerns about the loosening of restrictions on who HHS would release these unaccompanied minor children to. The whistleblowers saw that the children were being exploited, and it raised concerns to their superiors, who in turn raised it up the chain all the way to the White House. However, the White House denies any knowledge, and I quote, Andrew J. Bates, White House Deputy Press Secretary, said officials there had not known of the increase in child labor until the Times February report, end of quote. Ms. Grimm, your office conducted in-depth and rigorous investigations into the Trump White House's involvement in ORR's Unaccompanied Children program. Is the White House telling the truth about when it knew there was a rise in child exploitation as a result of ORR's decision to cut short sponsors' background checks.
Chairwoman Rogers, I cannot speak to what the White House knew and when.
Ms. Grimm, will you commit to conducting a full investigation to determine when HHS notified the White House and how it did so?
As part of our review of potential risks with sponsor placement, we typically do review correspondence. I will tell you that some of that information would be protected by privilege, but we are reviewing sponsor placement, and we hope that that report can be illuminating. And I am familiar with the New York Times report from yesterday.
Well, I look forward to that, your work and that report. Medicaid has faced persistent challenges related to improper payments and enrollment concerns. As you know, ensuring integrity of this program requires effective eligibility verification processes and robust collaboration between your office and states. And I'd like to focus on issues related to verifying eligibility for Medicaid. One issue that your office has frequently written about is the prevalence of states paying per member per month to Medicaid managed care organizations for deceased beneficiaries. In simple terms, dead people are continuing to participate in Medicaid at taxpayer expense. I hope I'm on safe bipartisan footing when I say that we should not be paying for care of those who have already passed. And your office seems to agree that we've sought to recoup payments for these claims. Can you speak to what CMS and the states could be doing to mitigate these issues?
I can. I think in your opening statement, Chairwoman Rogers, you had pointed to practical recommendations, practical things that CMS can be doing. Our portfolio of CMS oversight is vast and varied. We have recommendations that are cost savers. We have recommendations related to patient harm. We have recommendations related to improper payments. Is there a specific category you would like me to zero in on?
Yes, well, I'd like to ask, would it be appropriate to advise states to regularly check databases like the Death Master File, DMF, to ensure states are not paying for deceased beneficiaries?
Yes.
Okay, and will your office commit to reviewing current CMS practices and policies for interacting with states on eligibility determination systems, as well as identifying any areas for improvement and enhancement?
As part of the public health emergency unwinding, we are doing work where we're looking at Medicaid eligibility, where we're looking at errors, and I would need to look to see if that's already a part of that. But your requests sound very reasonable, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. The OIG audit of EcoHealth Alliance grant found NIH did not comply with the requirement to contact EcoHealth within 30 days of the nonprofit's failure to file its Year 5 progress report. Who at NIH was specifically responsible for this follow-up, and what was the breakdown that led to NIH noncompliance?
So I want to be very clear about what our EcoHealth report did and did not do. The objectives of that report were to look at NIH's adherence to federal requirements for grants oversight and for EcoHealth's adherence to federal requirements. At the outset, I want to be clear, we did not look at things like gain of function or the origins of COVID. I just want to be clear about that. So who was responsible?
Yes.
NIH had responsibilities for monitoring EcoHealth. EcoHealth had responsibilities for monitoring the Wuhan Institute of Virology and other.
So who specifically at NIH is responsible for this follow-up?
I don't have at my fingertips the exact title of the person that would be responsible for follow-up on.
Okay, I'd love, I want to ask you to get back with the committee on that answer, because we need to be looking for personal accountability and an understanding of what broke down so we can take the corrective action necessary. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone, for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you highlight in your testimony, the public health emergency due to COVID-19 will be ending next month, resulting in a great deal of change across the health landscape. You particularly noted that there are, quote, risks associated with the termination of waivers and flexibilities that were permitted under the public health emergency. And I share your concern and want to make sure that HHS and its partners are responsibly making this transition without Americans in need of health care falling through the cracks. So the question is, could you speak a little more about what particular risk you see with the unwinding of the public health emergency and how your office is preparing to assess those risks?
So one of the key focuses, Representative, that we are looking at is Medicaid and Medicaid eligibility. We have reason to be concerned about this. As pointed out last year, the error rate for Medicaid was over 21%. We have a rolling 3-year average of 15% in errors. Our historic work has found issues, particularly as it relates to eligibility. So we are interested in taking a look in the PHE unwinding the process for determining whether enrollees continue to be eligible or not, the accuracy, that those that should have benefits don't lose them, and those that shouldn't have benefits are not enrolled.
All right, thank you. Now, it's important that your office be adequately resourced to conduct oversight. As your testimony notes, President Biden's budget seeks an increase of $52.5 million for your office next year. So if your office were appropriated those additional resources, where would you focus on enhancing your oversight capabilities?
We would absolutely be starting with investigations. We, as I mentioned, are turning down between 300 and 400 cases a year. The budget, if approved, implemented, would allow us to hire more agents to address some of that case backload.
Okay. Now, you mentioned, of course, that rooting out healthcare fraud is essential to ensuring that appropriated dollars are spent where they are actually needed. And you state in your testimony that due to a lack of resources, you, quote, turned down 684 CMS cases for investigation. So can you describe the impact on the healthcare system when you're not adequately resourced to investigate fraud?
So those are significant cases that CMS refers over to us. We work closely with CMS, the Center for Program Integrity, and I will note that we have a very positive working relationship. So what that means is that there is unchecked fraud. We triage. I want to assure you that we're not letting in our assessment the highest risk, those that present the most harm or the most exposure to payments and people go unaddressed, but we're not able to get to certain very important cases because of lack of resources.
Okay, and then my last question, you also state in your testimony that your fraud investigations can, quote, return stolen money to the American people. Do you have an estimate of how much money your fraud investigations have recovered in prior years?
I do. If I could just turn to
Take your
Azar for a
time.
minute. So combined expected recoveries for our audits and our investigations last year were $4 billion. The return on investment for expected recoveries is 11 to 1, and that every $1 invested in us, we expect to return $11 to taxpayers, to the trust fund.
Oh, that's very impressive. So thank you, and thank you for the important work to uphold the financial integrity of the programs that I think are really central to long-term health and well-being of all Americans. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Dr. Burgess of Texas for his 5 minutes of questioning.
And I thank the chairman. And historically, I do want to point out how this subcommittee really has affected a lot of the positive changes that have occurred at ORR going back to 2014. The oversight of this subcommittee has been important. It's important that it be ongoing. Like Chairman Griffith, I am concerned because the ability to release a child to someone who has not been properly checked is of great concern. I adopted a child at one point, and the scrutiny that I was put under as an adoptive parent, I'll admit at times felt intrusive, but at the same time, you realize you're placing a vulnerable individual with the care of a family. And then Chairwoman Rogers already put it in the record, but this New York Times article from dated yesterday is one of the most searing and unfortunate recitations that I have ever seen. So I guess it just begs the question. Well, you've got in your written testimony, and you mentioned a report entitled "Operational Challenges Within ORR and the ORR Emergency Intake" of Fort Bliss, and I appreciate you including that reference. I pulled that, and it is apparent from that report that there were some changes in the guidance, the field guidance that occurred. Can you tell us a little bit about that, why that was necessary?
Thank you, Representative Burgess, Dr. Burgess, and I do remember coming up to talk to you at one point about unaccompanied children. The changes to the screening, there were reduced safeguards. They removed background checks and identity verification. So let me just back up. This was during the height of the surge in 2021 for the emergency intake facility at Fort Bliss. This guidance did apply more broadly, though. They removed background checks and verification for other adult household members and alternative.
Yeah, and let me just stop you there, because that's my concern. Some of this, I mean, who has the authority? Is it the agency? Are you required to follow law as passed by Congress? Or can the secretary or someone just decide, hey, this is too much trouble and we want to do things differently? I kind of knew this was happening. I, like the chairman, I went to Fort Bliss in 2021. I went again in 2022. Although we saw on the television the numbers were vastly increasing, their length of stays were decreasing, and the number of occupants were decreasing. That told me you're sending kids out there and you don't know where they're going or who they're going to. Was I wrong about that?
Are you asking if the sponsor screening was not adequate? I want to make sure I understand
Well,
the question.
I think I know that it wasn't, but I guess the big question is, who had the authority, page 15 of your report, where ORR issued field guidance that removed certain steps of the sponsor screening process across ORR facilities, potentially increasing children's risk of release to unsafe sponsors. No kidding. It really did. So who makes that decision?
That would be HHS would have the ability to make the decision to issue guidance. This was field guidance issued by HHS, by ACF, by ORR.
But when you start to connect the dots and you read the New York Times article, it sounds like the domestic policy advisor, Susan Rice, in the White House was kind of putting some pressure to let's get the throughput. And Secretary Becerra himself was quoted in a previous New York Times article as saying, you know, if Henry Ford was running this, we'd get these kids through a lot faster. But that's not the correct way to do things. And we all recognize that. That's why there are rules in place. I guess my question is, why? Who thought that it was okay to change the rules without consulting the legislative branch?
I want to underscore the role of an Inspector General. We are independent, we are objective, we strive for transparency and accountability. We do not make the rules, we assess programs according to the rules that exist. In our Fort Bliss report, we do point out that those waived requirements, in combination with a variety of other factors, increase the risk that children could go to an unsafe sponsor. We recognize the need for efficient and expeditious transition to a sponsor, but it needs to be done safely.
Yeah, it does need to be done safely. Ultimately, the decision was made by the executive. People do need to hold the White House accountable on this. This is shameful. It should never have occurred. Mr. Chairman, I've got a bunch of other questions. I'll submit them for the record, but I do want to thank you for holding this hearing today, and I just support your statement that you're going to hold additional hearings here.
I thank the gentleman. He yields back and now recognize the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And and I agree with Mr. Burgess, because this committee has had a long history of conducting bipartisan oversight of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, because these kids are so vulnerable, and it's really important that we get this right. We had a long series of investigations. There was a hearing in 2021 that I chaired with the administration, looking at the progress that the Biden administration made in reuniting the thousands of separated children that were actually not unaccompanied. They actually, well, they showed, I guess they were unaccompanied, they showed up, but they were with their families. They were ripped apart under the Trump administration policies, under the family separation policies. And so this hearing we had in 2021 was about what was going on with reuniting those kids with their families. And I just want to, Inspector General Grimm, I want to ask you about the current issues, but I always ask for a status update of that, because a lot of members of Congress are shocked to learn there are still many children who were taken apart from their families who have never been reunited. So I'm wondering if you know how many children who were separated under that program still have not been reunited with their families.
Thank you, Representative DeGette. I do not have the precise figure of reunited. I do want to point out that one of our reports in the early days identified children who had been separated from their parents or not categorized as being separated in HHS systems. Our report led to the identification of over 2,000 children who were then meant to be reunited with their parents. I can look into that figure and try to get back to you with that.
I would love that, and I do want to thank you, because that was the OIG that helped that happen. But my understanding is there are still hundreds of kids who were not reunited with their parents. Many of it, and of course, as time goes on, it gets more and more difficult. Their parents have returned to the home countries or whatever it is. So I would appreciate getting that information, because I think it's important that we continue to keep eyes on that issue to make sure that it's still continuing to happen. And to that point, I wanted to, one of the issues, and I think you've alluded to this, because OIG has produced 27 reports on ORR in the last 6 years, highlighting the challenges and risks caring for, quote, fluctuating numbers of children entering ORR's care. And that's part of the problem, is you might have a huge surge in kids showing up unaccompanied, and then it might plummet down. And so how you implement and administer consistent policies, I think, has been a challenge. So I want to ask you, how many of the recommendations that you all have made has ORR implemented fully or partially, and how many remain still open?
Thank you for your question, Representative DeGette. We have 57 open recommendations. I believe, I don't have the count of recommendations that have been implemented, so I don't want to give you the wrong
If you can
figure.
supplement your, also with that, that would be really helpful. And do you think, what progress would you say HHS has made in improving the ability to provide for the, quote, medical and mental health needs of children in ORR care that you mentioned in your testimony?
There have been strides that have been made in connecting children with appropriate mental health services, both when they're within the custody of ORR, and I believe in ensuring that they're connected with those services post-release.
So would it be your assessment that part of the problem is a lack of resources that hinder ORR's ability to care for the minors in its custody, particularly during these surges?
I cannot comment on the adequacy of resources that ORR has. I do know that we have recommended that this program be treated like an emergency with ups and downs in transfers and census, but I can't comment on the adequacy of the resources they have. I do believe that's a better question for the department.
Why can't you comment on the adequacy of the resources?
I don't have those figures in front of me. I haven't done any cost-benefit analysis.
So we would need to ask someone from the agency.
Yes,
Okay, thank you, we will.
okay.
Thank you, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, for his 5 minutes of questions.
I thank the chair for the recognition, and I thank the witness for being here with us today. And I want to associate myself with the thoughts that have been expressed by my previous two members. I actually, with Dr. Burgess, we did go to our facility, Fort Bliss, and it is bipartisan. We want everybody to be treated with respect. I'll just point out the issue that seems to be happening to the children is what, according to the Border Patrol, is what happened for the cartels as they come up through northern Mexico. I know that's not the purpose of this hearing, but we cannot talk about what happens to our children without mentioning the atrocious thing that the border policy, what's atrociously happening to them, that our border policy of attracting migrants to the border is happening to our children, and it's sad. It really is upsetting. But I know this is a subject for a hearing with different reports and different subjects, so I'm going to change the subject, but I do want to associate with that before I do so. On your June 2020 report for the FDA inspection process, and I'll quote from the report, it says, according to FDA, the investigators, supervisors are responsible for ensuring that the investigators are qualified to conduct inspections. FDA did not have written policies or procedures that require supervisors to verify that investigators that were assigned met the right training. I'll get to the question. Are there currently policies in place at FDA to ensure supervisors are aware and notify their lead investigators about these important training requirements, and why didn't they exist prior to your investigation?
Thank you for your question, Representative Guthrie. I do not have the specifics of that FDA inspection report in front of me. I'd like to get back to you if I could with more information on your, in response to your question.
Okay. So we'll go to warning letters. If we could move to warning letters. It says the warning letters are issued to achieve voluntary compliance. Warning letters are issued only for those violations that may lead to enforcement actions. So again, after FDA's programmatic changes, FDA conducted 9 foreign, for-cause drug inspections that resulted in warning letters. 3 of the 9 letters, 33%, were issued more than 6 months after the inspection date. Were these facilities in the United States or within foreign countries like China?
Representative Guthrie, I do not have that report in front of me. I apologize, I cannot speak to the specifics of that report.
Okay, so I have some other questions on that report. I guess I have to submit them for the record. So if you have this one or not. So your report notes that the FDA made programmatic changes, follow-up inspections at 6 OAI facilities. It took an average of 460 days versus the average of 329 at 11 OAI facilities. So you don't have that report in front of you either?
I do not have that report in front of me. I apologize.
Okay. I thought that was part of the hearing today. I guess not. I guess the question that gets back to the ORR, so the waivers that sped up that could have come from some of the sources that my friend, so they put waivers to process more children through the system, but those waivers resulted in some of the children getting to what we reported with slave labor and other types of issues moving forward. Isn't that correct? If it wasn't for the waivers, that might not have happened?
The report on Fort Bliss, and I have been down to the border, and I've visited multiple facilities over many years, so I've seen firsthand what these facilities are like. That report for Fort Bliss, it raises questions about the risk, the increased risk by these waived sponsor requirements and vetting processes. It does not reach a conclusion about whether any children were placed in unsafe households. We have an ongoing report that is looking at sponsor placement, and as I explained earlier, that report, I hope that will be out in the next few months.
So we do know children were placed in bad situations from ORR. We know that because we've seen the results of that happening. And so your report that you're working on is trying to specifically what contributed them to being put in the situation where they were used for labor?
That report is looking more specifically at sponsor placement, at what requirements existed, whether those requirements were followed, and hopefully we'll have some illuminating information on the results of some of those placements.
But the requirements that they look at is, as Dr. Burgess said, is that they're family members or someone, but not necessarily whether they have the right home, the right place, the right environment. I mean, you can find an uncle or an aunt that may not be the best person for that person to live with, even though they're blood related, correct?
Correct that they could be placed with a family member.
That's not the best circumstances, and when you don't check those sometimes you do everything, you check everything you can check, and some people, you just don't show up being not in the best situation. But if you don't check the situation, you obviously can put them in the bad situation.
One of the waived requirements was waiving looking at certain categories of sponsors and the adults that lived in the household with those sponsors. That is something that we identified as an increased risk for a child being placed with an unsafe sponsor and an increased risk for trafficking issues.
Okay, thank you. My time's expired. I will yield back. Thank you for your answers.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Federal health agencies are on the front lines when it comes to public health crises like that of the COVID-19 pandemic. They provide crucial guidance and resources, and maintaining public trust in health agencies is essential, I believe, to protecting public health. President Biden and congressional Democrats have consistently acted to provide adequate resources for pandemic recovery and bolster government capacity to respond to emerging public health threats. The American Rescue Plan made critical investments in public health measures that provided necessary tools that would be able to enable us to combat the pandemic. And the Inflation Reduction Act will help us make real progress in the fight against climate change and deliver savings on energy and healthcare costs for our families across the country. These laws are also have included oversight provisions to make certain new programs would serve their missions while protecting against waste, fraud, and abuse. What is troubling is hearing some of our Republican colleagues sow confusion and fear that fosters distrust in science and scientific research. This is counterproductive to the work that we must do to learn from the past and prepare for future disease outbreaks. With that, Ms. Grimm, your office is partly responsible for making certain that HHS is spending its resources as Congress intended and implementing programs effectively. How does your office's oversight work help increase Americans' confidence in the services upon which they rely?
Well, specific to grants, OIG's review of NIH's EcoHealth report and OIG's grants oversight work generally is taking a look at whether or not appropriate controls exist, expenditures are appropriate, whether controls like reviewing reports are followed. Getting those basics right are critically important and better ensure that funds that are spent through grants for intramural research, that Americans get the benefit of what those research grants are intended to do.
Yeah, is that information exchanged with the public?
I'm sorry, Representative Tonko, is what information?
Like all the parameters that you established to make certain that the dollars are being effectively invested, does that get exchanged in building that public confidence?
I believe that information related to grant expenditures is public HHS grants in 2022 amounted to $120 billion in grants. Out of NIH, $30 billion were spent on grants. Our work really focuses in on things like grant fraud, unallowable costs, threats to research integrity, and poor controls and monitoring. And some of these things, while they sound bureaucratic, are precisely the kinds of things we looked at in the EcoHealth report and found shortcomings that were very concerning related to high-risk research. If basic things like reviewing reports, if basic things like following up on late reports were done, we would have had better confidence in the kind of research that was being done.
Mm-hmm. As you mentioned in your testimony, we'll soon be in a new phase of recovering from the COVID-19 pandemic as the public health emergency comes to an end. Based on the work that your office has done, can you summarize some of the most important lessons learned that could help Congress and HHS prepare for future pandemics?
I can. Because this hearing was very wide-ranging, I have a lot of material in front of me. But there are a lot of things that we have learned from pandemic spending. There are 4 lessons that I would zero in on. When funds are rushed out to address emergency needs, it may mean that more needs to be done after the fact to recover misspent funds and build in additional controls as soon as possible if that program is ongoing. For instance, the HRSA that administered the Provider Relief Fund stood up a program very quickly, and we have recommended now that they go back and do more to look at payments to see if they were appropriate. They're only looking at 2%, which is something they decided to do deliberately to get money out the door. Even in emergencies, it's important to bake in as many program integrity safeguards as possible. Inspectors General can and have provided technical assistance and insights based on past work for the American Rescue Program and for other programs. Broad government-wide approach is useful. So the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, we know that if somebody is taking advantage of idle funds, paycheck protection funds, they are also likely taking advantage, and we have seen this, of provider relief funds as well, and improve data analytics. We need to do a better job of ensuring that data exists and is exchanged across partnerships so that we can more readily and rapidly detect and respond to improper payments and fraud.
Mr. Chair, I had other questions that I'll get to the committee and subcommittee, and with that, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Inspector General, y'all are busy.
Yeah.
You got a lot of work to do. I'm going to submit for the record, there are 5 requests from the Protect Public Trust for requests for investigation on a number of things, and I would love for the IG's office to respond on how those are progressing and whether they're even been addressed. Last month, CBS News reported about suspected double billing concerns within the EcoHealth Alliance, an NIH grantee related to its grant from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. According to this report, it appears that USAID OIG had opened an investigation. Has your investigations office reached out to USAID IG office on this matter?
I can't comment, Representative, on any ongoing investigations. We are aware of.
Are y'all also
double
looking
dipping, and
into
we are
it?
in contact with USAID.
Y'all are also looking into it as well?
We are aware, and we are in contact with USAID.
So in addition to USAID, you're just letting them run with it, and you don't have your ongoing investigation then?
I am not in a position to confirm or deny the existence of an ongoing investigation, Representative.
Thank you. According to NIH documents obtained by U.S. Right to Know under the Freedom of Information Act, the OIG concluded its investigation into EcoHealth Alliance in January of 2021, about 4 months after it was open. A 4-month investigation. Just from my understanding, is this investigation the same as the audit you recently conducted, or are they 2 separate efforts?
Representative, I will bring you to a process that our organization has. When something is referred to us, we have our executives that consist of our Deputy for Investigations, Evaluation, Audit. We meet weekly to discuss certain referrals and decide where the best placement is for some of these allegations. The decision was made to do a grants oversight review of EcoHealth, and I think that we have found very important gaps in grants management. I would not characterize that an investigation was open.
So let me ask you this. If your investigation ended in January of 2021, why didn't you issue the audit findings until this January 2023?
I would not I would not agree with that characterization.
2 years?
I would not agree with that characterization, Representative. We decided
The
to
dates
look
don't
at,
lie, ma'am.
I'm sorry?
The dates don't lie. You ended your investigation January of 21, released the audit findings in January of 23.
We don't comment on ongoing investigative matters, so I wouldn't.
So this is still ongoing then?
We do not comment on ongoing investigations.
Okay, so I'm gonna take that as a yes, because you issued your audit findings in January of 2023, but you can't answer my question, so I'm gonna assume it's still going on. 4 months is an extremely short time frame for OIG investigation. Why did your office close this investigation so soon when more and more documents were coming out about EcoHealth grants?
Our EcoHealth report reviewed 7 years worth of documentation, grants, guidance, emails. If we were to have found something that warranted an investigation, we would refer that over to our Office of Investigations.
Okay. But apparently the investigation's still ongoing because you can't answer questions about it, so I'm assuming that you found more than 7 years worth. Would that not be a good assumption?
Representative, I cannot comment on the existence
Last
of an
question on this
ongoing
issue. I guess you
investigation,
can't comment.
whether it exists or it
With
does
respect
not.
to this audit of EcoHealth, is it true that NIH only permitted your audit team to review already produced FOIA documents?
I do not believe that that is accurate. The access rights for OIGs are incredibly broad. We have access to materials that are, I believe, beyond what FOIA would allow.
What other documents did your team review as a part of that audit?
For EcoHealth Alliance,
Yes.
we reviewed 7 years worth of grants information for EcoHealth grants. We reviewed 3 grants. One of those was for the Wuhan Institute of Virology. We reviewed all grants guidance. We reviewed emails, correspondence.
So there was a
reviewed
grant
interviews.
directly to Wuhan Institute of Virology?
Not from NIH. They were a sub-award of EcoHealth.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. And now recognize Ms. Lesko of Arizona for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your work. It's so important that we identify fraud and waste in U.S. taxpayer dollars being spent. So thank you and your staff. I'm from a border state, Arizona, and I'm on the Border Security Caucus here in Congress. I have visited the border multiple times, and in my visits and in speaking to Border Patrol officers and local Arizona elected officials along the border, they have told me there is no vetting of the adults where immigrant children are being sent, and that girls are being placed in homes where they are sold into sex slavery. This is horrifying. This is horrifying if we are letting this happen. There was a memorandum of agreement put in place in 2018 between Department of Homeland Security and HHS that agreed to have a process for vetting who unaccompanied migrant children would be released to. I have been told that HHS and DHS changed the MOA after the Biden administration took over in 2021, and it removed the vetting requirement. In addition, according to reports, ORR does not have the ability to track released children, and, I quote, could not reach more than 85,000 children 1 month after they were placed with an adult. This is alarming. I mean, really alarming, what we are allowing to happen to young children. First question is, are you familiar with this change in the memorandum of agreement between DHS and HHS?
Vice Chair Lesko, I appreciate your question. We have made recommendations for better MOUs between DHS and with DOJ. I am not familiar with that specific change. We're happy to take a look at that and get back to you.
My next question is, how are sponsors vetted now?
That is a great question, Vice Chair Lesko. I do not have at my fingertips the exact guidance that is now being used to vet sponsors. That would be a better question to ask of ORR. I can tell you, though, that our report looking at vetting of sponsors will illuminate, hopefully, what risks exist in placing children with sponsors and what risk exists with the current processes being used to vet sponsors. Our reports have consistently recommended rigorous vetting of sponsors.
Well, I hope somebody listens to your recommendations, because this is truly alarming. It's truly alarming if the United States of America is allowing girls to be sold into sex slavery and not vetting who we're sending these people to. So thank you for your investigation on that. I have a question, changing subjects a bit. The HHS Health Resources and Service Administration manages the Countermeasures Injury Compensation Program, called CICP. It's charged with compensating those injured by the COVID-19 vaccinations. Very few cases, however, have been approved for compensation, and many cases have been sitting for a couple years now. Has your office looked into the operation and efficiency of this program?
Representative Lesko, we do have work that looks at the Provider Relief Fund and the Uninsured Fund. Both are programs that are administered by HRSA. We have work looking at, across many different audits that are touching about 50% of payments that have gone out from HRSA. Accuracy of payments in many instances would look at whether or not they were appropriately approved or appropriately denied. I am not familiar with this specific type of claim. Let us look at what our ongoing work is looking at, and we'll get back to you to see if this is touched on.
Thank you very much. My time has expired, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady, for yielding back. Now recognize Ms. Kamick of Florida for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here today. One of the top unimplemented recommendations in the OIG's 2022 report was ACF and HHS should improve their operational management and communication systems to better address the safety and security needs of unaccompanied children. Has the ACF and HHS implemented this recommendation yet?
Thank you for your question, Representative Kamick. We are in receipt, we just got it yesterday, of ACF's response to our recommendations. I believe that's included in there. We're reviewing their response. We need to look at documentation. We consider it open until we have a chance to review it. But it looks like what they're providing, if they can substantiate it, we would clear that recommendation.
So no.
It's open right
So
now.
no.
It's open right now.
Okay, so I think collectively, all of us in this room, we find this failure, the no, the implementation of the recommendation frustrating. Not quite sure why something like this hasn't been implemented, but it's good to know that HHS acknowledges that this is a problem. Especially given the fact that ORR's Unaccompanied Minor Program has received record funding for the past couple of years. Your 2022 report on the top unimplemented challenges notes that ORR is working on a, quote, emergency policy development protocol that provides input from staff with expertise in child welfare whenever ORR develops and reevaluates existing policies and field guidance. Do you know when this protocol came into effect, and was this protocol in effect at Fort Bliss and other emergency intake sites?
I don't know whether it was in place at emergency intake sites, but it was something that we recommended. It's something that ACF agreed with. It's something that they are claiming that they have addressed, and we're reviewing documentation.
Would you provide feedback to the committee on getting an answer on this of whether or not it was or not, since you said you're not sure?
Well, we need to get their paperwork and review it, and we will get back to you on whether or not we're considering it closed.
Okay, so looking at the annual report, reading between the lines of the annual report, it appears that your office thinks that this protocol is inadequate. Can you explain why the protocol didn't close out the recommendation?
So throughout the course of our ORR work, we have found challenges with horizontal and lateral communication. By that I mean communication across other departments with DHS, with DOJ. We found problems with there being lateral communication within ORR, so that concerns that are raised by field specialists, for instance, are not being listened to by those higher up. So there are a number of things that that ACF can do to address this, but it hasn't been addressed to our satisfaction. We find that this is a continuing issue across different administrations, where somebody in the field knows that census is going up. They don't have beds. They're concerned about mental health issues. They're raising concerns.
I understand.
Okay.
So, okay, I'm going to shift gears here because my time is running out. In the January 2023 HHS OIG report documenting how the NIH and EcoHealth Alliance failed to supervise the use of taxpayer funds at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Further, the Wuhan lab refused to provide lab notebooks and electronic files of a key experiment to EcoHealth. The NIH terminated the Wuhan Institute of Virology as a sub-grantee then at that point. The OIG report concluded that NIH should, quote, consider whether it is appropriate to refer WIV, Wuhan Institute of Virology, to HHS for debarment. The HHS OIG could refer the Wuhan Institute for debarment. That is correct.
That's what we're doing in the report. We're
Okay.
recommending that they consider whether or not they should be suspended or debarred. We do not have that authority. We make referrals over to the department. I'll mention we have reports in this area about suspension
And
and
since,
debarment too.
and thank you for that quick answer. So then with that, has your office followed up to see if NIH will refer the Wuhan Institute of Virology to HHS for debarment?
Their response is not due until July on that report. It is my understanding that they are considering suspension debarment.
Okay, thank you. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for being here. My big concerns is, whether is the excessive and increased funding that we're giving HHS being spent wisely. There's a couple areas I want to focus on. One is the FDA. The approval time for new cancer treatments is remarkably long, on average 7 to 12 years. HHS handling of refugee settlement, that's another problem I want to talk about. Let's talk about these NIH grants, though. This is a topic near and dear to me where, we have a major budget increase for cancer research, but not a clear direction for the administration on how we're speeding up approvals of new cures and therapies. So, do you know what portion of NIH funding goes to cancer research?
My understanding is it is $7.6 billion on cancer-related research out of NIH.
Yeah. And, how in the weeds does your office get in figuring out how that's spent and then developing metrics for how effective that money is spent?
We do not have any ongoing Representative Crenshaw work looking at cancer research out of NIH.
Okay, I would urge you to. Let's look at childhood cancer drugs, for instance. On average, 6.5 years longer than the approval for adult cancer drugs. Why? That would be a great question to ask. If we're going to increase funding for NIH and FDA, and we should know what we're getting for it. But the IG doesn't have any opinion on this, whether we're using those funds effectively at all?
We just don't have any ongoing work looking at it. We're happy to I would love for my folks to come up and talk to you about some of your concerns. We do have work looking at different processes that FDA has, including the accelerated pathway program, and we had some findings in that space. But we don't have anything specific to cancer research.
Okay, yeah, let's talk more broadly. So findings in that space, do you have a quick idea of what, could you tell us about that?
Well, OIG's mission is to ensure that taxpayer dollars are spent appropriately, and so our work looking at grants management ensures oversight so that taxpayer dollars on grants, and in the instance you're citing, grants specific to cancer research.
No, I said talk more broadly. You said you had findings in the space of the accelerated approval program. What were the findings?
Oh, I'm sorry. So that report looked at this process where they can approve drugs, but then they can have confirmatory trials later. We looked at the extent to which confirmatory trials were happening. Now, that doesn't mean that the safety is compromised, but the confirmatory trials are meant to look at the efficacy that's promised by the drug. We did find, I believe, roughly a third of those confirmatory trials were late, and a handful of confirmatory trials were late between 5 and 10 years. So as a general matter, what OIGs do is take a look at whether there's adherence to requirements. We do not set policies. I cannot force FDA, CMS, NIH to take the recommendations we make. We make recommendations and they decide to take them or not. But in that report, we looked at how they were following their rules and the time that it took for these confirmatory trials to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, there's also many rules surrounding the extent to which the FDA has to communicate with its customer, whoever's seeking drug approval. And have you done an investigation on how effective that communication is, quality of communication? Because that's my number one complaint I hear about. People don't, it's like a black hole. They can't get answers from the FDA. They have timelines for their investors, for their products, and they can't get a single answer from these people. Is there any investigations ongoing in that regard?
We have work looking at approval of drugs that would include Aduhelm for Alzheimer's, and we are looking at the extent to which there was communication with external partners. Now, in that instance, we would be looking at whether or not there was inappropriate types of communication. Okay. Would it be appropriate for us to come up and talk to you about some of your concerns about communication and see?
I'm looking for their effective communication, productive communication. That would seem because that would seem to fall right in line with handling taxpayer dollars effectively. If we're going to pay an agency to approve drugs, it should actually have a effective process for approving drugs instead of whatever it's doing now. And your office seems well positioned to maybe focus on that. We'd love to talk more about it, but I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Ruiz, for his 5
Thank you.
minutes.
Thank you for joining us today, Inspector General Grimm. I appreciate your office's consistent attention to the quality of care that unaccompanied children receive in ORR facilities. I remain deeply concerned about the treatment of unaccompanied minors who are fleeing dangerous situations and seeking refuge in the United States. These children are often forced to flee their homes due to violence, poverty, and persecution, leaving behind everything that they have ever known. I have seen firsthand the conditions these children arrive in. They arrive at our borders with little more than the clothes on their backs and are often traumatized by their experiences and their journey. It is our responsibility to ensure that these children are treated humanely and provided with the necessities they need to survive. I have previously introduced legislation, the Humanitarian Standards for Individuals in Customs and Border Protection Custody Act, that would work to ensure that immigrants coming to the United States to seek asylum are met with basic humanitarian standards, making sure that they have adequate food, water, sanitary conditions, and health screenings for survival. Inspector General Grimm, your office has issued an extensive report on conditions at one OR facility, the emergency intake site at Fort Bliss, where you outlined a number of necessary improvements. Could you provide us with an update on whether you have seen improvements at that facility and other intake sites?
We provided 5 recommendations for the Fort Bliss site. We are in receipt of ORR's response to that report. We are reviewing documentation to determine if the recommendations related to securing qualified case managers, that these case managers get comprehensive training and support, that emergency policy development protocol to allow for input from staff with expertise in child welfare, for usability and search capacities within the UC portal, and for ORR employees and contractors and grant recipients to be informed about whistleblower protections.
And has any of that been implemented?
They are claiming that they have taken steps to address all of our
But you haven't
recommendations.
seen the changes?
And we are reviewing the documentation. We just got it, I believe, yesterday.
So having examined the Fort Bliss intake site in such detail, what resources do you think your office or Congress can provide to ensure that unaccompanied children are treated humanely while in ORR custody and provided with the necessary medical services they might need?
Well, we are, I'm trying to find, I'm sorry, our request for resources. We are falling behind, Representative, in our ability to keep pace with the growing number of programs at HHS. The President's budget for FY 2025, if implemented, would provide OIG with much-needed resources. We have a legislative proposal in there in A19 that would rebase the Healthcare Fraud and Abuse Control Act. We have a request in for additional resources to provide oversight for the over 100 programs outside of Medicare and Medicaid. We have not kept pace.
Okay.
We have less than 2 cents for every $100.
So clearly, there's more resources that are
Yes.
needed. And now I want to turn to the importance of post-release services. Children can require a range of post-release services depending on their individual needs. Many of these minors have experienced violence, abuse, and neglect and require specialized care and support to heal from their trauma. Recent reports indicated that there is some inconsistency of services available to children after they have been placed by ORR with a sponsor. While I am pleased to see that HHS has committed to the goal of extending post-release services to all children after release from ORR care within 2 years, I want to be sure that ORR has the proper resources, training, equipment, and staffing they need to meet these children's needs. Based on OIG's past or ongoing work, could advancing efforts to provide post-release services have a positive impact on the safety and well-being of the unaccompanied children who have been placed in the care of a sponsor?
We do not have any ongoing work looking at post-placement services. We do have some ongoing work looking at transfers across different ORR types of facilities. I believe that would include specialized services, mental health services.
Well, HHS has committed to the goal of extending post-release services to all children after release from ORR care within 2 years. So I think that we should go back and sense what that commitment is, what's necessary to be productive members of our society, as there is issues that from trauma that can lead individuals into behaviors that are harmful to themselves and to others. And so that's why we need to address the post-traumatic stress. We need to address the sense of belonging, the sense of wellness in an early age in order to maximize the wellness and productivity of those children when they become adults. Thank you, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, and now if the witness will be so kind, we're going to have some wrap-up questions by both the ranking member and myself, and I'll recognize Ms. Castor for her follow-up questions.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again to the Inspector General for being here. In your testimony to us, you say on protecting health care, decades of HHS OIG enforcement and oversight prove the adage that fraudsters follow the money. When looking at a number of the CMS initiatives that are administered with the states and private insurance companies, you say program risks in Medicare and Medicaid can have huge impacts on enrollees and their access to necessary care and potentially result in improper payments that cost taxpayers hundreds of millions of dollars. OIG's oversight of the Medicare Advantage program is a key example. Over the past 10 years, Medicare Advantage enrollment has increased significantly, now covers more than 30 million Medicare enrollees, expected to cover 50% of all enrollees soon. But you say this rapid expansion has put program integrity and highlighted serious issues with compliance weaknesses with managed care plans, inflated payments to plans, enrollees with serious medical conditions that may not receive the needed care, and this kind of tracks with what I hear as a member of Congress trying to do constituent service if they're enrolled in Medicare Advantage. I do not have as much influence on rectifying a situation as I do with traditional Medicare. And you say our work has also raised concerns regarding improper denials of Medicare-covered services. Our work demonstrates that the risks of fraud, waste, and abuse in managed care are real and significant. They not only threaten the financial integrity of Medicare, but also potentially affect enrollees' health care. So what ongoing work are you doing now to combat fraud and abuse in Medicare Advantage, where there are a number of reports out there highlighting these issues as well? What's the ongoing oversight by the IG?
Thank you for this question, Ranking Member Castor. When I talk about my priorities, there are two issues that I always highlight: nursing homes, improving the care in nursing homes and protecting residents in nursing homes, and program integrity in Medicare Advantage. We have completed a number of reports. You just walked through a few of them, and we see issues with inflated risk scores. We have concerns that serious conditions, things like acute stroke, congestive heart failure, serious mental conditions that include bipolar disorder, plans that are getting increased risk score payments, and we're not seeing commensurate services flowing from those diagnoses. It is serious and real because on the Medicare side, we are approaching 50% of our Medicare population being served by Medicare Advantage. Some of the fraud that we see, in some instances, beneficiaries don't even know that they're involved in Medicare Advantage. We're seeing improper denials of services, and when we go and we take a look at those denials, we're seeing that they would have been paid for on the Medicare side. This presents concerns around access, because if your payments are denied, you have to take extra steps. Providers do, beneficiaries do. It creates friction in the program. I just spoke at a RISE conference out in Colorado Springs about some of our compliance concerns, and we have a call to action for Medicare Advantage industry to better police themselves. We are encouraging self-disclosure of inappropriate conduct. We desperately need more resources to get boots on the ground to take a look at what we're seeing as concerning, whether or not it's actually fraud, whether there are conspiracies on the part of plans to take advantage of loopholes in the program, whether that is indeed fraud. So that's an area, if we were to get increased resources, where we'd really like to get to ground on whether or not these concerns actually result in fraud.
And here we have all of the baby boomers retiring. It's stressing Medicare, and we've got a responsibility, the IG does, HHS does, and the Congress does, to ensure that the dollars are going appropriately to health care services and not to fraudsters. So I think that's an area ripe for oversight and investigations as well. So thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady. So let's clear up a couple things. First, one that I don't know the answer to, but I ought to, and I haven't heard it mentioned today. When you were talking with Mr. Ruiz, Dr. Ruiz, earlier, and you were talking about post-placement services and that kind of thing, one of the questions that entered in my mind earlier with other questions and with Dr. Ruiz is ORR notifying the local Department of Social Services that a child has been placed in their area. And the reason I ask that is that we see these reports where the kids aren't being educated, they're not in school, they're having to work these long hours. A lot of times your Department of Social Services will check up on a kid to see, well, okay, we know that, you know, little Johnny arrived here. How come they didn't enter into the West Salem Elementary School? Why aren't they in the middle school? And they can follow up on that. Are we doing that? Are we notifying them?
Chairman Griffith, I don't know the answer to that question, if ORR is notifying local officials.
Can you find out for me?
I will
All right.
look into that, yes.
You can look into that, and I'll look into that further as well. Also, I think there may have been some misunderstanding. When you were talking to Ms. Kamick, you indicated on Wuhan Institute of Virology that you had recommended to NIH disbarment or debarment.
That they consider.
Right, but don't you have the authority to go directly to HHS's money folks and recommend to them, as opposed to going through NIH, go straight to HHS and say, we recommend they be debarred?
We make referrals to the office that handles suspension and debarment. In fact, we did a report on that.
And did you send Wuhan up to them as well, as besides making a recommendation to, did you make a referral to HHS as well as a recommendation to NIH?
I don't believe so.
All right, and so the question then comes to me is, have you done that with EcoHealth Alliance?
In our report, we do not recommend suspension and debarment for
Okay,
EcoHealth.
so I got to ask why. Because we know that EcoHealth was delayed on year 5. We know that in year 4, they delayed reporting in year 4 excessive virus growth on their progress report to the NIH. They violated their contract because they didn't get the information from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And look, we will never know now. Because we didn't get those reports, we will never know what they were doing at that point in history and whether or not something bad was about to happen inside the lab. And whether you're a believer that it was a lab leak that caused COVID-19 or whether you think it was an animal, that information would be critical in a virus that killed millions of people around the world to have. EcoHealth Alliance violated their contract. They were negligent, they were sloppy, and they didn't do their job. Why in the world wouldn't we debar them?
Our report does not recommend suspension and debarment.
Why? With all of these violations, they just didn't do one, they did 2 or 3 things that I consider major violations of their contract. So why aren't we debarring them?
Our auditors that did this work have to adhere to Yellow Book standards, professional standards. Their analysis did not, in their view, warrant a recommendation.
Are they lawyers or scientists, or do you have a combination?
They are auditors, and our work is reviewed by attorneys.
Okay, well, I just got to tell you, I see this kind of a breach as an attorney. I see this kind of a breach. I ain't doing business with those people anymore, and it drives me crazy that we're spending the American taxpayer dollars with a company. We're currently spending money with a company that negligently handled the records related to coronaviruses being done, research being done at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and it's a plausible theory. I think it's clear and convincing evidence that it came out of the lab. I think it was an accident, but others may have different opinions. Doesn't matter. Either way, if we had that information, we'd have the ability to make a better decision on where this virus came from that killed millions of people in the world. And I don't understand why we're spending American taxpayer dollars supporting a company with that kind of a record. I yield back.
Chairman, can I?
Yes, ma'am. I'll give you a minute. I went on a little tirade there. I'll give you a minute to answer.
Okay. The report points out a number of issues that the department itself could take action and suspend and debar EcoHealth Alliance. We don't say they shouldn't suspend and debarment. We have another report that talks about the suspension and debarment program that was released a couple of years ago, and we found a number of opportunities. The majority of referrals come from us. For suspension and debarment. We don't see referrals from CDC, from NIH, from ACF, from CMS, other grant-making, contractor-giving officials, and we note that in our report. The department could make a referral to that entity to look at whether or not they could be suspended and debarred. And we do point out in that separate body of work that there are more opportunities. We shouldn't be the only ones recommending suspension and.
So you think we should expand the ability to make those recommendations? And do you think that we should have the ability for HHS to fine bad actors, to have a monetary penalty when they don't submit the reports that they're supposed to submit in a timely manner, particularly when you're dealing with deadly substances, pathogens?
Our work does not have any findings on fines. We do note that 90,000.
But you wouldn't be against them if we in Congress decided we wanted to do that. Ms. Castor, I went over my time. Do you want another minute? All right. Okay, thank you very much. Seeing that there are no further members wishing to ask questions, I would like to thank our witness again for being here today. In pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask the witness to submit her response within 10 business days upon receipt of these questions. And without objection, the committee is adjourned. Thank you very much, ma'am.